So the structure of the talk today, I've just realized there's a screen here. What is an academic journal? So the title of this talk was How to Get Published in an Academic Journal. What do we mean by academic? Then we'll look at the process of submitting an article. What do authors, what do you, authors out there watching online, what do you have to do? And what's the process of getting published? And then crucially, in order to get published, you have to know what the journal you're writing for, what they want. You have to know what they want, what they're looking for in a publication. And we'll run through the sorts of criteria that journals operate under. Okay? And just to emphasize that if you're writing for publication, you're writing for a journal, the key thing is to know what that journal wants. It's really difficult to write a paper and just send it off to a journal thinking it'll get published. You have to know what the journal's about. So we'll have a look at those sorts of things. And to flip side of the coin, what do journals not look for in an academic paper? So that's the way the talk will be structured. Okay. So, what is an academic journal? Okay. What does an academic journal, what is it that's different to a newsletter or a teacher newsletter or a magazine? What makes an academic journal? And the key thing about an academic journal is, first of all, it has an editor. In the ELT Journal's situation, that's me. But the interesting thing about an academic journal is it's not just the editor who makes all the decisions. It's not just the editor who looks at papers. The key thing about an academic journal is it has this process peer review. Peer review. So what happens is there's a panel of reviewers on an academic journal. And who are the reviewers? The reviewers are yourselves. They're peers. They're people within the profession who are familiar with the journal, who are familiar with writing for the journal, who are familiar with the field. And it's those people that help the editor, that help me decide what's published. So in an academic journal, it's this process of review, for a paper being accepted by our peers for publication. That's an academic journal. And the important thing is that although the title of this talk says an academic journal, not all journals are the same. Not all journals are the same. Okay, so in our field, you may be familiar with ELT Journal, there's the Journal of Applied Linguistics, there's TESOL Quarterly, there's journals of computer and assisted language learning, of technology and language learning. There's many, many journals in ELT and TESOL, but they're all looking for slightly different things. So if you're going to write a paper for publication, the key is knowing what those sorts of things are. So not all journals are the same. So an academic journal has an editor. Journals are reviewed by peers, by people in the field, and we'll have more discussion about that shortly. And journals have different emphases of the kind of things they're looking for. So if you're wanting to write up your ideas, write up your research, those are the key things. So here's an important question. We're sitting here and the assumption is, let's write for an academic journal. But why? What's the point? What's in it for yourselves? What's in it for the profession? Okay, we've had loads of discussion so far. Simon Borg yesterday, Ulama Matthew today, about teachers becoming engaged, teachers researching. Okay, and what was very interesting, certainly in Simon's talk yesterday, was the number of times he talked about sharing ideas. So why would you write for yourself? Well, there's a few things. Firstly, I don't know how you feel about writing. Personally, at the end of writing, I'm quite pleased. But when I write, that's when my ideas become clear. Writing is a form of thinking in many ways. So as we write for publication, our ideas clarify, and it's a form of professional development in itself. A second reason for your own professional development is you have an idea, you've worked on something, you've done your research, you've thought about your context, you've found something that works. Is that it? You just keep it to yourself? You could share it with your classroom colleagues, your school colleagues, or you could share it with the profession at large. So writing for publication is a stage of professional development where you can share what you've done, you can share what works, what you've found, you can share your research with people in other professional contexts. So there's a huge element of it being part of the process of research, if you want it to be. And beyond that, of course, writing for publication is something that some employers want people to do. There's status in it as well. And so that's from an individual's perspective. That's why we might want to write a paper. But also beyond that, the profession moves ahead by sharing of ideas, by writing. Okay, whether that's in teacher newsletters, in magazines, in academic journals, in British Council publications, or whatever. This is how we share information. Nowadays, people are writing in blogs and so on and so forth, which are a completely legitimate way of sharing ideas, but we can also write papers. So it's a way of professional development. We move on as a profession based on the shared knowledge that we develop as a profession. So why write for an academic journal? 2 reasons: for yourself, to crystallize your ideas, to share your ideas for your own professional development, but also for the development of English language teaching as a profession in India and in the world at large. So there's a couple of reasons why we might want to write for an academic journal. And of course, when it comes to writing and submitting a paper, there's always 2 sides to the coin. There's the editor's perspective, there's the journal's perspective, what are we looking for? And there's the contributor's perspective. What are you looking for? And we'll come to that in a moment. Right, I'm going to stop for a couple of minutes. Are there any questions at this point? Are there any questions at this point? We have a question. Do we have anybody with a microphone? Sorry? Doubts. Just wait a tick. Well, it's a difficult process, and my job to...
We have no access to most of the international journals, as how to move, as how to approach, and what are the things that are important for, writing articles and all.
Okay, so the question is what's important and the access to the internet. Yeah, that's
what's important and what's not important, and what is to be included and what is not to be included, and what is the correct way of writing articles for international journals.
Right. Okay. So there's 3 different issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Three issues, some of which we'll come back to shortly. First of all, what's important and what's not important in a journal, I'll deal with in the slides coming up. Okay. But to find out what is and what isn't important in a journal, you're quite right. You need to be able to access the journal, to be able to read it, to know what it's about. Okay. I can't speak for every journal, but obviously all journals now have a website, so you do need to have some web page access. Most journals have a limited amount of papers, of content, available online, sample copies if you like. And it's very worth trying to access these sample copies to get an idea of the journal. Unfortunately, journals being journals, they're products, so to get the full journal requires some payment. But most journals have some papers available, and that's what you kind of need to try and find to get an idea of what things are about. Okay? In terms of the criteria and fulfilling those, we'll come to that shortly. Thank you. Was there any other questions at this point? We've got somebody down the front.
You did mention that different journals have different focus.
Yeah.
So maybe please know what is ELT Journal's focus.
Aha. Okay, so in terms of ELT Journal's focus, that will perhaps come through when I look at criteria. But ELT Journal, so many journals in applied linguistics are looking for research, the kind of formal research that Simon was describing yesterday as being quite daunting, perhaps, for many practitioners. Surveys, experiments, and so on and so forth. ELT Journal does look for research, but it's research which informs practice or practice which informs theory. The ELT Journal treads a line between theory and practice. The readership of ELT Journal is for practitioners, for teachers, for teacher educators, and articles must be relevant for teachers and teacher educators. It's not a journal of formal experimental research. It's not a journal which talks to other researchers. So the kind of people that write for ELT Journal are teachers, teacher educators, and researchers. But the key to ELT Journal is that the audience, the reader, is us. So articles must have systematic investigation of practice, whether that's practice in teacher education, practice in teaching, practice in materials design, but it must be relevant to us, teachers, teacher educators, teacher managers, teacher trainers. That's the key to it. And maybe that's a way of thinking about publication for articles. Who's going to read this? Why are they reading it? And what do they want to get from it? And if you think of that for the kind of publication you're writing for, who's reading this and why? What do I want to tell them which will be relevant to them? Think of the reader. That will help you shape your paper. And in ELTJ's case, it's this theory-practice link. This theory-practice link, where research, the kind of research we've discussed at this conference, that Simon discussed, that Rama discussed, small-scale investigations which are systematic, which show some kind of development, which are interesting to teachers elsewhere, that kind of thing is the sort of thing we publish. Now, I realize by saying this, that sounds relatively straightforward, and it's always going to be more complicated. Okay, what do I mean by interesting? What appeals to readers? But those are the sorts of principles we're starting with. Anything else at this point? One more, and then I'll move on.
So actually, you told like it is editor's perspective. What if I keep it in mind as my fellow teachers as audience, and then why can't it be an audience perspective?
Right. So when I say, so the editor's perspective is my perspective on the process. It's my perspective on the process. But the point you raise is absolutely spot on, because when I talked about peer review, this leads us to what about the audience? Because the peers, as I'm about to go on to, the peers in peer review, it's a process whereby I receive papers and I send them out to a review panel. The review panel is made up of teachers, of teacher educators, of people who are familiar with the journal, and fundamentally their job is to look at the paper and look at the rigor and systematicity of the paper, but also to judge, is this what appeals to the readers? And that's what we mean by peer review. The peers are in the halfway house between trying to see if the paper works from an academic point of view and trying to see if the paper works for the readers. That's why they're peers. So absolutely, the readership matters. And the editor's job is to try and work with the papers, work with the authors to meet the needs of the readers. That's what we're trying to do. That's the function of, there's no point having a journal if nobody wants to read it. So that's all the way through the process. So I'll move on to the process now, which might help make things clearer. Okay, so this is what happens in terms of the submission process. I'll talk through the submission process, and I'll come back to this process of peer review shortly. So if you decided to submit an article to a journal, it could be ELT Journal, but it could be any academic journal, the article will be received and acknowledged. In ELT Journal, we have an online submission system. Okay, so to access ELT Journal for publication, we have an online submission system. You put your paper in, you get an acknowledgement, and then, as editor, I have a look through all the papers that are received, okay, and I have a look to see if some meet the general criteria of the journal, and if so, they're sent off for review. But some papers we receive just don't meet the journal's criteria at all. They may be too long, they may have the wrong number of references, they may be on a completely different topic. Obviously, some people send papers to lots of journals just because that's what they do. So, for example, in ELT Journal's remit, in the last year, I've received papers on philosophy with no mention of teaching. I've received papers on literature, which is very interesting, but it's not what ELT Journal does. ELT Journal has a word limit of 4,000 words for an article. I've received papers of 7,000 words. We can't publish those. We have a limit of 15 references per article. I've had papers received with 30 references. We can't publish those. So those sorts of papers which just don't fit our criteria, they have an immediate rejection. What then happens to the papers that could be interesting, that could be publishable? I put batches of articles together and I send them out for this process, peer review. So when an article gets published in ELT Journal, The final decision is mine, but I am advised, strongly advised by peers. That's their job. So I send an article out to peer review. It goes to 2 reviewers. It goes to 2 reviewers. The reviewers, and this is important, the reviewers don't know who wrote the article. Names are removed, so it's an anonymous process. Equally, the person who's written the article doesn't know who the reviewers are. It's anonymous both ways. It's anonymous both ways. So the papers are sent out, and within about 30 days, I receive the reviews back. Could I have the slides back on, please? Could I have the slides? Thank you. So the reviews return to me. 2 different people give me their suggestions about the paper. I consider the reviews, and then I send a decision or a comment, what have you, to the contributor. So that's the basic process. A paper comes in, some are completely unworkable for the journal concerned, the others go for review. I get the reviews back, I send a message off to the contributor. And this is the kind of thing, or these are the things, that in most journals a contributor will receive. After a process of review, 2 independent reviewers will say, actually, there are problems with this paper that aren't really solvable. There are problems with this paper that aren't really solvable. I'm afraid this won't get published. We're going to reject this paper. And we'll have a look at the kind of problems that are insolvable shortly. And that happens with a reasonable number of papers. Maybe there's a logic in the research. Maybe there aren't implications for teaching, those sorts of things. So that's disappointing for authors, obviously. A different kind of decision that many authors receive is the second one along, request revision. Request revision. This is where reviewers have read the article and they see something interesting in it. They think that it could work for the readership. The emphasis on could. It could work for the readership. But changes are necessary. Changes are necessary. So what happens in that situation is that the reviewers will almost certainly give suggestions for changes. They will list what the issues are with the paper that need to be addressed. I will take those on board. And the request revision message goes back to the author and says, this is an interesting paper, but if it's to be considered for publication, changes need to be made, revisions need to be made. The message goes to the author. With any luck, the author goes, okay, that's interesting, I want to take this forward, reworks on the paper, resubmits, and it comes back and the process starts again. So that's revisions. Possibly after a process of revision, and occasionally after a first submission, reviewers get back to me after having read a paper and say, actually, this is a really interesting paper, and it's almost ready for publication. Almost. In this case, it would be termed a conditional acceptance, or some journals would call it a minor revisions. In that situation, the paper just needs fine-tuning. There's 1 or 2 details that don't quite work, that with a little bit of work could go forward to publication. And in that situation, I get back to the author, I say, this is a very interesting paper, it's almost ready, could you do 1, 2, 3, 4 things? Or some number like that. It comes back to me, I just check that, and then it moves forward. That's conditional accept. And finally, and I have to say, very rarely, there's a straightforward accept. When somebody sends in a paper and it just fits the bill for publication, no issues, no organizational issues, no lack of clarity, no lack of logic, it's just spot on, that would get a straightforward acceptance. In the end, all published papers get there, but it's rare for an initial paper to be accepted straight away. Just to look at those 4 possible decisions, an accept, as I've said, is very, very unusual. A conditional accept is usually after a process of revision. Most decisions that go back to authors request revision or are rejections. Okay? And almost everybody, if not everybody that's ever been published in an academic journal has had to revise a paper, and almost everybody that's ever published in an academic journal has received a rejection letter. I've had rejections from journals, and it's very disappointing, and the issue is, can you go again and try and make the paper work for something else? Okay, so central to all this, and this finally gets to your question, is this process of peer review. Peer review, just to re-emphasize that. Peer review is central to the academic journal. It's central. Without it, it doesn't fulfill the criteria that we sort of mean by academic journal. So the question was, who are the peers? Okay, if you were to look in the cover of any journal, but I'll talk about ELT Journal, you'll see a list of, I think at the moment, 19 people from around the world who work in our profession. Okay? They come from a variety of countries, a variety of contexts, with a variety of interests. There's men and women. There's people from the UK, from the United States, and other countries. There's people from India. There's people from Japan, people from Singapore, and so on and so forth. So it's a cross-section of the profession. They are invited onto the panel for a number of reasons, but the main thing is they are familiar with the journal. They've probably been published in that journal or another, and they know the field. And they work in the field. They are current. So they are peers of ourselves. The review panel, certainly for ELT Journal, renews itself over time. The reviewers work with the ELT Journal for 2 or 3 years, then they move on to other things. So there's always a change, a contemporary change within the reviewers, certainly of ELT Journal, to try and keep up with the times, to give people a chance to review. But also, one of the things certainly in ELT Journal is people who review other people's papers can't publish in the journal. So there's no sort of thought of any kind of, manipulation of decision-making. So these are the peers. And the peer's job is to help me read a paper, see that the paper works, and see that the paper works in the interests of the journal's readers, the readership. Blind reviewing means that the reviewers don't know who's written the paper, it's anonymous, and the people who've submitted the paper don't know who the reviewers are. The only person who knows who is who in the entire process is me. Okay, and I don't tell anybody. So we try and make it as anonymous as possible for obvious reasons, so that decision-making, that comments are as objective as possible, and so on and so forth. It seems the fairest way. So this is peer review. A question you might want to ask is, does peer review work? Well, I'm obviously going to say I think it does. It's sort of a tried and tested system across journals over time. People will always come back and be disappointed about what reviewers have said, but the reason we have more than one review with an editor overseeing the process is to try and make it as fair and not transparent in that you know who people are, but in terms of the process being as objective as we can possibly make it. We get different perspectives on each paper, which I then evaluate, and then we move forward. Okay. Any other questions at this point in time before I move on? Any questions? This is the question. Okay, right. If this is the question, let us move on. Okay, so in terms of getting a paper published, it's about writing for the specific journal. Writing for the specific journal. Okay. Yes, sorry. Yeah.
You mentioned blind and double-blind peer review.
Yes.
I didn't get the double-blind.
Okay, it just means it means it's both ways. It's blind that the reviewer doesn't know who the author is, and then it's double-blind that the author doesn't know who the reviewer is. It's a two-way process. That way, people don't know who the person reviewing is. That way, we don't know who the author is. It's double-blind. It's just an expression. Complete anonymity.
Excuse me.
Yes.
What makes you immediately accept a paper and immediately reject a paper?
Sorry?
What makes you immediately accept and reject a paper?
So an immediate reject of a paper is one that just doesn't meet the journal's criteria. Something that's too long, something that's on a different topic, something that has the wrong number of references. So any journal has criteria for paper. For ELT Journal's criteria of 4,000 words for an article, 15 references, it's got to be about English language teaching. So if I receive a paper for 7,000 words about English literature, it's not ever going to get published in the journal. In that case, I write to the author and say, I think you've probably got the wrong journal here. Maybe send it to a journal which is more concerned with issues supporting literature teaching. That would be an immediate rejection. It can't go any further because it's not what our journal's about. Does that help?
I have a question,
Yes.
sir. Do journals have a double review process? I mean, I faced this once in my paper submission. My article was accepted in the first review process for one particular journal, international journal, with some major revisions. But when it went to the second review process, it was rejected. So how did it happen? I couldn't understand the process.
How did?
I've already accepted papers in other journals.
Well, when we get to if we come back to this slide, okay, if we have a look at the revision request, the second column, if we request revisions, that means what it says. This paper cannot be published unless it is changed. Okay? This paper cannot be published unless it is changed, unless the recommendations we suggest are taken on board. So really a journal, you shouldn't get to a stage where you're saying, where the editor says, this can be accepted with changes. No, sorry, this is accepted, and then that offer is taken away. That can't really happen. All that can happen with request revision is we say, this can't be published now. If you change it, it might have a chance. That's what request revision means. If you change it, it might have a chance. So as we go across the screen from right to left, acceptance for publication becomes more likely, but it is only guaranteed in the final column, accept. Everything before that is a condition or a change. Okay? So you really shouldn't be receiving a message saying this is accepted. Oh, sorry, no, it's not. That's not professional from the journal's point of view. But it has to be understood that until you get that final message, the paper hasn't got acceptance for publication.
Yeah, excuse me.
Yes, where am I looking? Oh, yes.
So you said the word limit is about 4,000 words.
For the ELT journal, it's not about 4,000 words, it is 4,000 words.
Suppose it is only, say, 2,000 words, 2,500 words.
2,500 words. Well, this is a very interesting question. The reason a journal has a word limit for an article is not just to make people work harder. I think the suggestion would be, my view would be, it's possible to have an article of 2,500 words. It is possible. However, if an argument, if a project, if an idea is to be fully explored, can that be achieved in a satisfactory way in only 2,500 words? So we don't publish papers of 4,000, 3,500 words just because it's fun. It's because we judge that for our readers, that's the time it takes to fully explore the issues. So I'm giving you an answer which is sort of slightly ambiguous. It's possible to have a shorter article published, of course, but you know, the words are there for a reason, the word limit's there for a reason. I should say actually, although our maximum is 4,000 on ELT Journal, the recommended is it's 3,500. That's the kind of area we think that ideas can be fully explored. Anything longer, too long for our readership. We can't publish enough papers in a year if we take twice as long. Anything shorter, well, possible, but has the author fully explored the ideas? I'll move on to the criteria now. Can we have the slides back up? Thank you.
Hello. Sir, excuse me.
Where am I looking now? Okay, last question, and then I'll move on, okay?
So, what are the criteria for contributors?
Okay, we'll move on to that. Perfect question.
Academic kind, research and work of art, I want to say.
Perfect question, thank you. You're my linking person. Can we have the slides back up? Okay. So, you want to submit a paper to a journal. You've got an idea, you've done some work. It might be a small-scale research project on your own class. It might be action research that Simon was talking about. It might be something bigger. You might have done a survey of a school. You might be doing interviews. You might be doing surveys. You might be doing diaries. You might be doing observations. But the key to something being published, certainly in ELT Journal, is it's a systematic investigation. It's got to have a degree of systematic. ELT Journal links theory and practice, for example. It's not teaching tips in our journal. It's an investigation. So what are peer reviewers looking for? Okay. A paper has to be, and I know how ambiguous this is, relevant and interesting to readers of ELT Journal. Okay? Relevant and interesting. That's what reviewers are looking for. So how do you know, as a potential author, whether your paper, your idea is relevant and interesting to readers of ELT Journal, or relevant and interesting to readers of another journal? You have to know the journal. You have to be able to judge whether your article, your idea fits the journal, which basically means you need to read the journal. You need to have a degree of familiarity with it. I don't mean read every issue cover to cover. That would be ludicrous. But as I mentioned at the beginning, most journals have some papers freely available as example papers of what the kind of things the journal are looking for. It's available online. Okay? A key, if you want to submit a paper to a journal, is to read a couple of articles from that journal. It gives you an idea of the ideas, of the aims, of the format of a paper. It's central. All journals also have web pages with aims and objectives. This journal is looking for such and such and such and such. This journal is looking for that. Okay? Be familiar. What often happens, and this is what leads to immediate rejections, is people aren't familiar with a journal. They write something, they spend 2 months writing a paper, 4,000 words, they send it off. Okay, but they haven't looked at the journal. They haven't thought about the target audience, and the chances are, if you just write a paper without thinking about the journal you're wanting to submit to, the chances are it won't fit. You can manipulate the paper you write to fit a journal if you know what you're writing for. And those 2 months you've spent writing a beautiful article will be better spent if you've got something in mind. Okay? It's just central. So the vast majority of papers that get an immediate rejection is because people aren't familiar with the journal they're trying to send a paper to. And it just doesn't quite meet it. So what peer reviewers' prime concern is this idea, is this paper interesting and relevant to the readers? So it comes back to the readers. That's what peer reviewers are looking for. And my job as editor is to work with the peer reviewers to think about what the readers want and think about whether a paper works for readers. Next criteria. Does the paper, the idea is interesting. We like this idea. It's about tasks in the class. It's about project development in India. It's about the use of materials and adaptation of materials. It's about teacher education. Okay, the idea is interesting. The next criteria then is, does the paper work in that box of 4,000 words? Is it clearly and coherently written? Do ideas flow from one another? Can the reader understand what's trying to be argued? Is it clearly and coherently written? A very similar point, is it internally consistent? Do ideas at the start of the paper match ideas at the end of the paper? Does it not contradict itself? If data is presented in the middle, are the conclusions fitting for the data? Is there some literature which introduces the topic, and is the literature suitable for what follows? Those sorts of things. So if we wanted to think of a traditional paper, it would have an introduction, a little bit of literature, some method, some data, some findings. Does it work? Does the literature support what comes in the conclusion? That kind of thing. Is it consistent? And here's something. Is it accessible? Is it accessible? And this very much is where you need to know the journal. By accessible, we mean, does it work in a language that the readers understand? Okay, does it work in the language that the readers understand? If we take ELT Journal, it links theory to practice. So it assumes some degree of that the readers are interested in theory, but not loads and loads of jargon, not all sorts of psychological concepts which we as teachers don't relate to. If there's a concept that needs to be in the paper, it needs to be explained, if it's a concept that you and I as teachers won't relate to. So a paper needs to be accessible for the readers. And as different journals have different kinds of readership, some journals are more theoretical than others, that's why you as an author need to know who your readership is. You need to know what the journal's about. Okay, in case of ELT Journal, this appropriate balance between theory and practice. So ELT Journal is not a journal just of practice. It's not just, I did this in the classroom and it worked. Why did it work? How are you sure it worked? Did you evaluate it? Were there any problems with it? Those are the sorts of things which link theory to practice. Okay? But ELT Journal is not just a journal of theory. We don't want somebody just writing an experiment which has no relationship to classroom practice. That's not what the readership's interested in either. So what ELT Journal's interested in is, what has somebody done, or somebody found out about a classroom, and why is the classroom like that? And what might that mean for teachers or for teaching? That's the kind of balance. It's a tightrope. And if that sounds difficult to quite get a handle on, try and go to our website to read a couple of papers to become a little bit more familiar. And that's the same point. Practice rates to theoretical principles and theoretical concepts are clarified by practice. ELT Journal is a journal written for practitioners, teacher educators, materials developers. Okay, and here is a very tricky one. Of course, as we think about our classroom, or as we think about how we use our textbooks, or as we think about how we develop our tests, or how we work with teachers in teacher education programs, of course we work in a context. I work in this context. I work in the UK. You work in India, most of you. Okay? But the interesting and slightly difficult thing for somebody writing a paper is that an account of what you found out about a specific context has to be relevant to readers working elsewhere. So you can't just write a paper, or one can't just write a paper which is about where I work, full stop. What have I found out that helps people elsewhere develop their own practice? So accounts of specific contexts have clear implications for people working in other contexts. Okay? Because otherwise it becomes very inward-looking. But it has to be outward-looking to what the readers are after. And finally, because we are trying to be at the cutting edge of the field, papers need to be aware of recent work in the field. As we know, no ideas come out, well, very few ideas come out of the blue. We all build our knowledge on what's already gone. So authors need to show they've got some awareness of prior knowledge, which they're taking and working into their own context and developing something specific to their context which other people will be interested in. That kind of thing. So those are the things that peer reviewers are looking for. It's a very admirable list, but I'm quite aware that it's also a difficult list to follow. So the flip side of the coin might make things clearer. What are peer reviewers not looking for? And I think this might help bring what we are looking for into sharper focus. Okay. Papers which I send out to peer review, when peer reviewers get back to me and say, actually, this doesn't work for the journal. One of the reasons that peer reviewers often give is the paper's too theoretical. It's not linked to practice. Somebody has written about second language acquisition, and they've done a very interesting experiment about second language acquisition, maybe using 2 or 3 learners in a laboratory situation. It's really, really interesting, but it's not for our journal. It's for a different journal, because the author hasn't gone on to say what this might mean in terms of practice. So a rejection from the after peer review might be because a paper's too theoretical, not sufficiently linked to practice. On the other hand, some papers are just about practice, only practice. I did this in my classroom, and it worked really well, and the learners liked it. But why did they like it? Why did it work? How did you investigate this systematically? So there's many, many forums for people to publish. I did this in my classroom. It worked really well. You might want to try it. Teacher newsletters, teacher magazines, there's loads of places to publish that material, but in terms of ELT Journal, that's not what we're really about. It's practice and theory together. So a second reason why peer reviewers might come back to me and say, actually, this is just about practice. It's best placed somewhere else. There's no link between theory and practice here. Okay. Number 3, reviewers might get back to me and say, well, this was quite interesting, I suppose, but we've seen it all before. There's nothing new here. The author hasn't looked at what is already out there and tried to take it further. As an academic journal, you're looking to try and push knowledge so that readers find something new. We're not looking to publish something that people already know. People might already kind of know it innately at a gut level, but they might not have had it demonstrated. That's legitimate. But if we're just publishing things that people already know, that's not new, that's not what a journal, whether it's ELT Journal or any other journal, is about. So authors do need to not reinvent the wheel. Authors do need to be aware of other work in the field. As I mentioned earlier, quite often papers write only about what happens in their own context, without thinking of what this might mean for people working elsewhere in the world. Most journals now, and especially ELT Journal, have an international readership. ELT Journal readers can be found in over 100 countries in the world. So every investigation has a local context. The interesting thing for an author to find out, and this goes back to professional development and thinking through ideas for ourselves, is what does my context have in common with elsewhere, or what I have found out, how might that be relevant to people around the world? So going back to why would you write for an academic journal, it makes you think. It's quite a hard process. It makes you think. How does this relate to somewhere else? But in doing that thinking, the profession develops because we're sharing ideas. And this is a sort of a broader criteria, an interesting idea, but it's not yet developed. It's not yet fully developed to make it suitable for publication. Somebody's had an idea, they've started off an investigation, but they haven't quite got enough evidence for what they're claiming, or they haven't quite investigated something systematically, or they've claimed something that actually it doesn't really show in what their data is and what their research finds out. Okay, it's an interesting idea, but it's not quite come together. It's not quite coherent. It doesn't quite work as a paper. Okay, I'm going to run through a few tips. Oh no, actually we'll stop there. Any other questions on that? I've run through an awful lot of criteria, and the criteria are the tricky thing. We'll go to the gentleman in the glasses. Could we try another one?
Yes.
Oh, good.
You spoke a lot about teachers who are willing to publish, but they don't have the systematicity and the rigor.
Mm-hmm.
So you recommended that there are newsletters available for them for the publications. Now, for teachers who have predominantly completed their academic study, bulk of their academic study,
Mm-hmm.
but who lack the systematicity and the rigor, what would your recommendations be?
Well, notice I didn't say that they lack a certain research methodology. I'm trying to state a difference. What I'm trying to suggest is that people have approached an idea, thought about it, come at it from a relevant angle, think, how can I find out about this? Maybe getting learner diaries, or maybe making observation notes. And then they've analysed that set of data, and then they've produced some kind of claim or recommendation. So there's been a process. They've engaged in a process. If we think back to Simon Borg's talk yesterday when he was talking about teacher research, he did emphasize it's a process. So it's a synonym. I said systematicity and rigor, a process. There's a process of thinking and researching there, is what I mean. It's not just, aha, this really worked, I'll write it down. Something a little bit more, something reflective, process-based in terms of finding out. We'll go to the gentleman over there.
Sir, this is something related to relevance. That is what the peer team looks for. And the fourth point is what they don't look for. You said that the local situation may not be considered.
No.
But my question is, when we think of relevance, the relevance of a situation in a place like India may not be suitable in a developed country.
Yep.
At the same time, you would like to know the situation in a developed country. So what wrong is there if the local situation is focused in your journal?
Okay.
Please.
I didn't quite say a local situation is not relevant. I said a local situation has to be made broader. Okay, so we can accept that readers of any journal are going to have different interests. They may be teacher educators, material developers, classroom teachers, researchers. Not every single idea in a journal, in every paper, is going to appeal to every reader. However, to write about a certain context, there will be similar contexts in that same country and beyond. And even people working in other contexts can have an interest in something very different. But it can't quite be, this is what happened in my classroom, full stop. It has to have something that somebody working elsewhere can try and get hold of and take on for themselves. What happens in any location can be interesting to other people, but you just have to kind of make that link. You have to write as if somebody isn't with you. That's perhaps the best way of saying it. Think that the reader doesn't work where I work. The reader doesn't work in my context. How can I make this interesting and relevant for them? You're not writing for the person next door. You're writing for the person in the other place about where you are so that it appeals to them. We'll go to the front.
This is closely related to the previous question
Okay.
and answer. I just wanted to know if there are any practical steps that you can recommend to where we might take the local context to the greater context.
The only practical step I can recommend is to try and get hold of one or two papers and read the objectives. If the reviewers and myself think an idea is potentially interesting, but it doesn't appeal yet, then the decision will be revise. All these criteria, you don't get a rejection on the basis of one criteria. If there's potential in a paper, but it doesn't yet have the implications that somebody else will be interested in, the decision will be revise and try and work these implications in. There will be an opportunity. If there's enough of value in a paper, but something is still missing, that's why there's a revised decision. So the recommendation will be made, have you thought about ways of trying to make this relevant to somebody somewhere else? So you'd get a chance to do that. Beyond that, practical tips is to try and be familiar with any journal that you're trying to submit to. Okay, we had a lady here, and then I'm going to have to move on before final questions.
Is it possible to publish ELT Journal in Central Asian countries? Especially, for example, in my country, in Uzbekistan, we don't have journals in English. Because English is being taught in schools as a foreign language. And in my opinion, especially this ELT journal, if it's published in Central Asian countries, it will help to develop teaching process, and because in India it is quite different, because English, the level of English is much more higher, I can tell.
Yeah.
And is it possible to publish in other countries also?
To publish in other countries?
Yes.
Well, ELT Journal is available, as are all journals, in all countries. So if you're talking about cost and price, that's a slightly different issue. But ELT Journal is available via online in all countries. It's also available in hard copy. So it is available. The issue then would be, I think, I can't talk about this at the moment because it's not what I do, I edit, but OUP, the publisher, as do all publishers of journals, then have a sort of pricing system for different contexts. The best thing to do with that question is to go to the ELT Journal's website and have a look at sort of pricing and availability and things like that. But all journals publish in all countries at the moment. Okay? I'll move on to some conclusions. Okay, so I've talked through a process. Writing for a journal is incredibly rewarding. Okay? It's incredibly rewarding. It leads to your own personal development as a teacher, as an ELT professional. It leads to professional development because, of course, if you get published in a peer-reviewed journal, people think, oh, that's great, blah, 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 blah. So it's a very, very rewarding experience. It's difficult to write. It's difficult to go through the revision process, but it's worth it. It's worth it because your thinking becomes clearer, you become more aware of the field, and so on and so forth. But I have some tips. Could we have the slides back up? Okay. If you're going to write for publication, and I must have said this 10 times in this talk, write with a specific journal in mind. Don't just write a general article and send it off. That will be likely to be rejected because you haven't thought about the audience. So please, if you're thinking of submitting an article, if you've got a really good idea, think where would that best fit, and then write the article for that journal. Read that journal. 2 or 3 articles in that journal. ELTJ, for example, as I've said, online, there's a few articles available. Do read them. Get the feel for what the content is, get the feel for how authors put the argument together, get the feel for how you might construct your paper. Try and read the paper. The key cause of immediate rejections with ELT Journal is people haven't read the journal and they're sending papers that don't fit. So read. And I'm not talking about just ELT Journal, anything you're thinking of submitting to any journal. Be familiar with what you're trying to write for. Get the author guidelines. All journals have author guidelines. ELT journals, for example, are available online. By author guidelines, it's the style guidelines, word limit, number of references, kind of data, those sorts of things. Get the style guides and write within them. Maybe start small. Think of the ideas that have been put out there at this conference. You don't have to do an enormous research project which takes years and years and has 1,000 participants and has a survey and has statistics and has this and that. It doesn't have to be like that. Start small. If you have your own research project, as long as you follow it through a process which is systematic, which is rigor, as Simon was saying, it might be interesting. It might be worth writing up. It might be worth thinking about and putting down on paper. Why does this work? Is this useful for other people elsewhere? What was difficult about it? What is there in the literature which supports what I did? Actually, does what I did fit the literature? Maybe I found out something new. But starting small is okay. We all start small. Okay? And here's the key one. Don't give up. Okay? As I said at the beginning, I think you would be very hard-pressed to find any published author in any journal that's not been rejected at some point. Really. I've been rejected. Okay? So don't give up. If you submit a paper and it comes back with, well, this is interesting, it could be published, but you need to make changes. Try and make changes. Don't go, oh no, I've got to spend another 3 months writing this thing and I'm sick of it. I've been there. I know the feeling, okay? But it's worth trying, because if you can make those changes, maybe you'll get there. Okay, so don't give up. Don't give up. That's the key to it. Writing for publication can be very rewarding, but it's a process of highs and lows. But the highs are worth it, and if you've got an idea, it's great for yourselves to try and develop that idea, to think it through, and it's great for the profession, because that's how we all move forward together. That's ELT Journal. That's our website. On that website, you can find a few sample papers. You can find details of subscription. You can find author guidelines, what else? Everything else that I said in this talk, really. Okay? So that's our website. We've probably got 2 minutes for questions. All right. If there, any other questions? Okay, we've got at the front here.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you especially, what is the format of writing an article, especially if we think of a format, because I have been browsing a lot of articles, they follow a particular format. That is, the first is the introduction, then the literature review which follows. So that is very confusing sometimes because all the articles are not the same.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I found difficult was how do we frame our subheadings for all the paragraphs that we devise.
Okay, so there is a traditional format for a paper, which I might as well summarize, but it doesn't mean it's the only thing you can submit. So a sort of typical paper would start with an introduction to set the scene. It would then draw on relevant literature to broaden out the context. It would then have a look at what I, the author, did, research methodology. This is what I found, some data. This is the conclusions, the discussion, the implications. So that would be a traditional paper. Okay? It's a decent guideline to start with. There's some flexibility within that, so you don't, if something doesn't quite follow that, it doesn't mean it's not in the journal. But that's a starting one. In terms of subheadings, well, there's a huge variety of ways that people approach subheadings. Some people are sort of really, really standard. They just go introduction, literature, method, data, result. You know, other people decide to try and tell a story through subheadings. You know, setting the scene or key facts. And there's some flexibility there. As a paper evolves in the process of revision, with peer review, with editorial advice, these things can change. I would say if you're starting to write an article, try and get the basic structure right to tell your story. Don't worry too much about the ins and outs of subheadings because you could spend hours worrying about one word or another. Just get the overall story told. The key to organizing a paper is that internally coherent and accessible. Okay? If a paper works for read from start to finish, it doesn't matter what the subheadings are. It just needs to work from start to finish. We can worry about that later. Okay? Any other questions? Yes, lady. We'll go this way, and then we'll come up. Go over there. All right, we'll go there, and then we'll go there. Okay?
Could you please highlight something on the impact factor and global impact factor?
I knew there'd be a question about impact factor. Okay. I looked it up last night. So for those of you that are interested in such things, and many people are not, an impact factor is a rating that's given to a journal based on number of citations. It's put very crudely, it's how influential a journal would be, how much impact it has. Okay? And rankings get published each year, and so on and so forth. ELT Journal's impact factor is 0.743 at the moment, which gives it a rating. It's 59 out of 160 in linguistics and 97th out of 216 in education. Okay? A lot of authors in a lot of contexts are very concerned about impact factor. It's on our website, so you can double check that, and it's very important. Some authors are not interested in impact factor. As an editor, I have to balance the two concerns. Of course, it's nice that ELT Journal has an impact factor, but it's not the be-all and end-all of what ELT Journal's about. Other journals have different perspectives on impact factor, but if you want the impact factor, 0.743. We had the lady here.
Hi, Graham. My question is, what qualifies a person to contribute to these journals? Because you mentioned what are the criteria, the word limit, the references. But let's say you have somebody who doesn't have any degree in ELT, doesn't even do any teaching in schools. Let's say people who train in corporates, but again, they are still teaching English as a second language. So can a person like that attempt to send an article?
Absolutely. The publication doesn't depend on who you are or what you do. Obviously, what you do may have a connection to what you write about. But there's no qualification criteria for writing for the journal. If you look at the journal, you could see typical people that tend to write for the journal, but that's no barrier to people who write. Everything's anonymized anyway, so If somebody has an idea which they've systematically looked at and worked through and researched and want to write up, they should submit it. Who you are, your level of qualifications, your level in an organisation, that's not relevant.
Thank you so much.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I am Chandan. Once the paper is submitted, how long does it take to be reviewed?
Okay.
And here back.
Sorry. We try to get feedback to the authors within a maximum of 60 days. It's usually quicker than that. Yeah, less than 2 months.
And the second review to resubmission?
Resubmission, I think we give authors 6 months to do their revisions, and then it goes through the process again. Obviously, it's nicer if the authors do it quicker than that, but that's the limit we give.
Articles. Is there any difference between writing in American way of writing article and British way of writing articles? Is there any difference? Or any common global trend is there?
I'm going to completely avoid that question.
Okay, Graham.
And by, no, I haven't answered, by suggesting that it's not about whether it's American or English journal, it's about what the specific journal's looking for and its own style. Okay? Because you will find different journals in the UK have slightly different style guides and slightly different things going on. And different journals in the USA will have slightly different things going on. So my recommendation would be to get myself off quite a difficult hook. Don't look at the British-America thing, look at the specific journal and see what it's looking for.
Okay, Gaurav, here's my question.
Yeah.
Our professor very interested with the number that's nothing but ISSN online and ISBN, and our professors are not really, they're not satisfied with the articles published through ISSN numbers because they are very not substantial at all. Right. And what's the standard format? Is there any ISSN number with standard series or code or the different judging online journals that we have to follow rather than ISBN numbers?
I can only really talk for ELTJ. ELTJ is published, although it is published as an online version, it is a hard copy, and therefore it has a full ISSN number. So I can't really go beyond that. It's not something, because we all work in different contexts, I'm not familiar enough with the discussion of ISSN numbers to know what your institutions would be after. But in ELTJ's case, as a paper-based publication, you can get a physical copy of the journal, which is then made available online, because for many people in the world, why get a paper copy sent around the world? It therefore has an ISSN number. Okay? Beyond that, I can't comment on other journals. Sorry about that. Anyways, we have man in the red turban. Go there.
So this is in continuation to the question asked by my friend over there section. When she asked a person who is not having any degree and who want to get a paper published, maybe he's a keen observer, he's got many skills, but he hasn't got any methodology, like the systematic way to write for the journal. If a person is interested in learning that methodology, because the person is not having any PhD or any MPhil.
Yeah.
So how can...
well, that's the difficult thing. So in answer to your question, I can say it doesn't matter who you work for or what your level of qualification is.
Yes.
So it doesn't matter in principle at all. Anybody can submit. However, the criteria that I outlined there still hold to any author. Because, so therefore, if somebody wanted to submit a paper, they would have to be able to try and meet the criteria of the journal. Now, the issue of whether somebody who hasn't got the academic qualifications can do that, there's many people without qualifications who could do that, but of course there's many people who can't. So I think the issue you're raising is a much broader question of authorship than I can't answer that here. How can somebody get the skills to meet the criteria? That's a broader educational question and a broader knowledge question that somebody would have to address for themselves, unfortunately. But in terms of whether you actually need a qualification to write for the journal, no, not in principle. But obviously you need the skills to be able to follow through a paper to get it published.
My question is there any bridging course a short course?
A course?
Yeah.
I'm afraid not. I'm afraid not. Okay. If I just give you some numbers, ELT Journal receives 550 papers a year. So I have to read 550 papers a year from about 30, 35 are published. So 550 papers a year is over one a day, and I have a job and children. So we don't have a course. People would have to find their own ways of reaching that level to be able to do that. But I do appreciate the point. I do appreciate the point. We can have one more question. One more question? Yes, sir.
Sir, if paper is rejected, then do you inform where we went wrong? Because there are many points of rejection.
Do. Yes.
Thank you.
Straight answer. If a paper doesn't fit the journal, if it's rejected before peer review, or if it's rejected during peer review, you get a list of issues. It was rejected for this reason and this reason and this reason. Yes, absolutely. Because the whole point of the messages we then send to authors, it's not just a question of saying, it doesn't go in the journal. It's a question of even a paper that doesn't get accepted can help the author develop. Even a paper that doesn't get accepted is worth it because you learn when you're writing and you get advice on the paper following review. Yet another reason to try and submit. Thank you very much.